So good morning, everyone. Day 5. Welcome back. We are moving then into the session on item 11, non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. We have Joe with us from Melbourne. I'm not sure what time it is in Melbourne, Joe. You probably don't want to say, but
it's almost the weekend.
Right. We'll go through the papers as Joe's, as they were posted, but with the addition that, as advertised earlier, subject to discussions, we and members' views, we may well look to go for a vote on approval on this item. With that, Joe, over to you.
Thank you. So thanks, Ian. So this session is to review the comment letters received to ED 79 non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. And as Ian just mentioned, we are hopeful that we can get approval for this IPSAS at this meeting. The purpose of this project is to develop an IPSAS aligned with IFRS 5 non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. As such, the proposed IPSAS has quite a narrow scope, as it is only intended to address transactions for the sale of assets that are made on commercial terms. ED 79 was issued in April 2021 as part of the suite of the measurement standards, and we received 34 comment letters which staff have reviewed and analysed. So, just going to skip over that slide because hopefully this was the next steps. Hopefully we won't need to bring this back in June. So ED 79 only had one SMC, specific matter comment, and this SMC asked whether an extra disclosure should be included in the final IPSAS for when the carrying amount of an asset held for sale was materially different to its fair value. So just as a reminder, when an asset is classified as held for sale, it is measured at the lower of the carrying amount and fair value less cost to sell. So we propose to include this disclosure, which would require that an entity would disclose the asset's fair value if that carrying amount was materially lower. The intention is to increase the accountability and transparency by public sector entities for when they sell public sector assets. There was a 79% positive response to this proposal. Therefore, we are recommending that we proceed with adding this disclosure. We did, however, receive some comments from respondents that they were not sure whether the fair value disclosures in paragraph 54 to 56 would apply to this added disclosure. So we have included paragraphs 57 and 58 to make this clarification, and they are shown in markup in agenda item 11.3.1. Therefore, the question to the board is whether the final IPSAS should include this added disclosure. So I'll hand that over to the board.
Okay, thanks, Joe, for that summary and that introduction. I think that's very clear. Can I take any comments from members on the proposal that we retain that proposed disclosure, and also the addition of those extra paragraphs 57, 58 in response to comments? Yeah, Lynn.
Thanks, Ian. So I think this is a really, really important disclosure. I think when we debated it and we wanted it included, it was Camira's suggestion, and I'm very supportive of including it. I do think we should recognise, though, that the challenges that the respondents have sort of raised in terms of making the disclosure, and the cost that might be associated with assessing the fair value. And it's a bit like if you are going to dispose of an asset at a determined price because that's the regulation in your jurisdiction, you've still got to make this fair value disclosure. And I do think, there could be a whole host of different places you might go to get the fair value disclosure. And it's almost like you could stick them in a mixing bowl and, property being out comes the result of that in terms of a fair value disclosure. So I do think we should retain the disclosure, but I do think we ought to think about guidance to help people do determine it in practice. So I do think it's an area to think about some additional guidance, not in the authoritative text, but in supporting implementation on this.
Thanks, Lynn. I'll take comments from Camilla. I think on this one, we have to think about the interaction, though, with the measurement standard, given that that has extensive guidance on fair value. It has a hierarchy in terms of how it's determined. So let's go to Camilla and then to Todd, and I'll take comments and from members, and then we'll come back to the Secretariat when we've gone round. Okay, so Camilla, then Todd.
Thanks, Chair. Yes, I just had one comment. I agree that this new disclosure had a good acceptance. Even when we presented that to FOCAL last year, FOCAL members were quite supportive of this disclosure in terms of transparency and all that. But then there was one country that also responded on that and also made us aware of one. They say that in terms of transparency, it will also good to require a disclosure on the other side, that what will happen if the fair value is materially below the carrying amount, that in that case they will suggest also a disclosure for that, because that will imply an impairment, and that perhaps just for symmetric reasons, if we are asking a disclosure when the carrying amount is materially below the fair value, we should also ask a disclosure when it is the other way around. Thanks.
Ross, do you want to come back on that before I go to Todd?
Yeah, maybe just 2 quick points. I think the disclosure point and the concern about having to disclose the fair value is a little bit odd to me, because to comply with the measurement requirements in the standard, you have to measure the lower of carrying amount or fair value. So you must know the fair value to do that, to comply with the standard. And to the point, when the fair value is lower than the carrying amount, then you would actually just lower the cost of the asset that you're carrying on your balance sheet. So I don't know why you would need additional disclosure, because you'd literally just write it down and carry it at that value until you disposed of it.
I mean, just on the fair value point, I mean, essentially, as this is something, as these are assets that you're actively marketing, you would expect to know reasonably what the fair value would be. I think it's not an intellectual exercise. It should be something that you're actually, you need as management. Todd.
Thanks, Ian. I agree with the recommendations, but probably going to Lynn's point about guidance. I don't know whether it's guidance or not, but I think it's very important in issuing the standard, some of the communications that go around it. And I say that because I come from a jurisdiction that has basically adopted the standard. And I think it often gets used or looked to for situations that it's never been intended to apply to. So this has been intended to apply to a very limited set of circumstances where you're actually selling or disposing outside of the entity or group. And it sometimes gets used by analogy for, situations where there may be transfers between public sector entities within the group and that sort of thing, which I don't think it's intended for. So I'd like to make sure that there is good communication when this is issued, that, we are aligning it with a private sector standard, and its use in the public sector is for sale or disposal outside of the group. And that might help, I think, with certainly some of the comments that have come in that are concerned in this area, if we get the right comms around it.
Thanks, Todd. Ross, to that.
Yeah, Todd, I completely agree on that point. I know Joanna does as well. We've had conversations on this and the need to continually reinforce the scope of this standard, because even the board itself, we've had in the development of ED 79 confusion over the intent of this standard and the scope of coverage of transactions. So I think it is important that the at a glance in the communication material webinar clearly make that point, as we did in the exposure draft itself. But again, just to reinforce those points.
Okay, thank you. So Camira, you want to come back in, and then I'm going to go to staff on this point in terms of adequacy of guidance.
Thanks, Chair. I just had two comments. One, to reply Ross' comment on the case when the carrying amount, the fair value is below the carrying amount. Yes, it's true that of course the entity needs to adjust the value of that asset but perhaps this information will not be clear enough in the financial statement. That will be obscured now when we are updating our conceptual framework on that. The information will not be clear for users. Perhaps on that light, the disclosure will be helpful. And then I had another comment in terms of the disclosures. Are we already in that point, or should I wait later on for the two paragraphs that are added?
Can you wait on that one, Camira? I just want to end this point.
Yes, thanks.
Ross.
Yeah, again, coming back on that, I think the standard's quite clear that you need to present and separate those assets separately in your financial statement. So I don't think there'd be any obscuring of that information. It would be quite clear. And I think actually adding disclosures talking about the adjustments you've made is adding more information than is needed for this, and is probably going down that obscuring information by adding too much information. So I completely agree on the disclosure on the fair value being higher than the carrying amount, because that's useful information for the users, because that's not in the financial statements. But in the case where you've actually had to adjust your carrying amount, I don't think there's need for any additional disclosures aside from what's already in the standard.
Okay, thanks, Ross. And I think, we do already have guidance in other standards in terms of, I mean, on the fair value point, I think we've already got sufficient. We don't need additional guidance here. That was why we issued it alongside, so that you could see them together. Okay, so Camira, your point on disclosure now?
Yes, thanks, Chair. It was in the proposed addition of paragraph 57, where we are clarifying more specifically which information should be disclosed about the fair value. I see that we are omitting the point on disclosures, the point D. So that is for fair value measurements categorized within level 3 of the hierarchy. That is when there is unobservable data. I think that specific disclosure is important, because if the entities are using level 3, also unobservable data, to estimate the fair value, they should provide some information on that. So I'm not very convinced why we are leaving that out from the disclosures. Thanks.
Thanks, Camira. Joe, do you want to come back on that one?
I'm just thinking Dave might be better to address this. These paragraphs 57 and 58 are the same paragraphs that are in the proposal for ED 78. So we've got the same fair value disclosures, but I do understand Camira's point that perhaps with public sector specific assets are going to sell that they may be looking to a level 3 fair value, especially if it's a specialised asset. So
yeah, what you haven't seen, Joe, is he's already stuck his flag up at this end, so I'll pass over to him.
I don't have much to add from what Joe just mentioned. The only point I wanted to clarify is 57 and 58 are aligned with IFRS 13 disclosures. So as a result, we took the requirements from IFRS 13 and pushed them into IPSAS 44. And that's how we came up with those requirements.
Okay. Camira, you consent with that?
Not really. Yeah, not really, because I think for the public sector is especially, so that could be dangerous. So if we leave it out that entities do not need to disclose anything, if they use level 3, then they will start using level 3. They will say, yes, we use unobservable data for the fair value, and then they will not disclose much more detail on how they calculated that. So I think there is a public sector reason for including that that disclosure that is already there on the point D. So thanks.
Dave, do you want to come back on that? Or Ross?
So again, if you step back and look at the standard and how you get into it, you must have a plan to sell an asset. So you must be assessing how you're going to sell it. So I'd be quite surprised if you have an active plan to sell an asset that you own and you and again, meet all the criteria to classify it as held for sale, and then you make an argument that you only have level 3 inputs that are unobservable. So how can you have a plan to sell something if you have no idea of what any market would be for an asset? Because again, we're not talking obscure financial instruments where you need to use unobservable inputs to price them. We're talking assets held for sale, so real assets, so property, equipment, and groups of assets. So I would be quite surprised if you'd ever be holding something for sale and be able to argue that you're using level 3 inputs. So I don't think it's needed in this case, and that's probably why it's not an IFRS 13 for this disclosure.
Okay, I think that's a reasonable, and let's remember that we're putting this additional disclosure in for accountability purposes in terms of that difference between market value and carrying amount. Okay, I'll go to Liz Fee, and then I think it's Lindy and Lynn in that order.
Thank you, Chair. I actually support the staff recommendation in retaining the requirement to disclose a material difference that is in paragraph 52. But I think what is still unclear, or maybe we have to consider, is incorporating in the standard what will be the reasonable level of materiality as a basis to know whether the fair value of the asset should be disclosed in the notes of the financial statements or not. So I think the word materially lower still have to be, I think we should still have some guidance on that so that this will be understood by our constituents. Thank you.
I mean, I think, Liz, there's an overriding issue, isn't there, in terms of, you know, applying materiality. I mean, that's why we put it in the framework. That's why we, you know, so I don't think we can put that in everywhere because it's pervasive in terms of that's the judgment that you make in preparing financial statements. So I think you know, you're right that you would need to apply judgments on materiality, but we can't put that in absolutely everywhere in terms of our standards. Okay, Lindy, you're not in any longer. Okay, so to Lynn and then Adrienne.
So my comment wasn't on this. My comment was on paragraph 58. So you've got your disclosures where you are holding at fair value, and then you've got these disclosures where your fair value is materially higher than what your carrying amount is, which is what we've just been discussing. And then we've got a very prescriptive paragraph 58 that doesn't distinguish between the two types and says put it all in a tabular format, which I think the tabular format is aimed at those that you're holding at fair value, not also the ones that you are merely disclosing the fair value of. So I just thought 58 needed a bit of work. It does, I mean, it does say unless another format is more appropriate, but I just think we sort of dip in and out in this section of where we're holding at fair value, where we're just disclosing at fair value. And then I just did wonder if 58 was needed at all, to be perfectly honest.
Would anybody object to Lynn's proposal to delete 58? I'm not seeing anybody objecting to that. Indeed, obviously, Adrienne was in support of that. So I think we delete 58 on that basis. Okay, and I see nods from other members as well. So good. Okay. Great. Okay. So I think then, Joe, if you want to move us on to the next item.
Okay, so we're moving on to agenda item 11.2.3. And this paper addresses the other comments that were made to ED 79. We did receive quite a few other comments. I mean, we did review and analyse all the comments, but we noted that many were addressing issues that would expand the scope of the project. And as we've mentioned, this is quite a narrow scope standard. And at the June and September 2020 meetings, the board discussed the scope and measurement requirements for the project and decided to retain what was in IFRS 5. Therefore, we've made the conclusion that no new issues were identified that needed to be addressed. However, one respondent did note that in paragraph 24, it refers to assets attained in a combination that would immediately be classified as held for sale, and then they would be measured at fair value less cost to sell. Now, in IFRS 5, this would work because in an IFRS 3 business combination, assets would be measured at fair value on acquisition. Therefore, fair value less cost to sell would be lower than the carrying amount. Because obviously fair value becomes the carrying amount, take the cost to sell off, and your fair value less cost to sell is lower than the carrying amount. However, in a public sector combination, you can also have an amalgamation where the assets are measured at the existing carrying amount. Now remember, we're only talking about those assets in an amalgamation that are to immediately be classified as held for sale. So they would be transferred across at their carrying amount, but paragraph 24, as currently drafted in the ED, then says that you would need to measure this at fair value less cost to sell. So this could mean that some assets may actually have to be written up to fair value less cost to sell. Now, the board had this discussion in 2020 when we were talking about whether we should just have fair value less cost to sell, and concluded that we shouldn't ever write up from a carrying amount, a lower carrying amount, to fair value less cost to sell, because it would give rise to revenue, and that was inappropriate. Therefore, we've amended paragraph 24 to state that when an asset acquired in an amalgamation, public sector amalgamation, that is going to be immediately classified as held for sale, it should be measured at the lower of carrying amount and fair value less cost to sell. So it is consistent with the measurement principle in IFRS 5. We've also made some other editorial amendments which were identified by respondents, and they're all shown in markup in agenda item 11.3.1. And so the question to the board is whether they agree with the amendments that we've provided.
Thanks, Joe. So I think if we take the amendment to paragraph 24 first, and then I'll pick up comments on other amendments. Okay, so in terms of the proposed amendments to paragraph 24, can I take any comments from members on those? Yeah, Lindy.
Thank you. It's quite minor. I think we just have to update the comparison to IFRS at the back, because then it will be something that we need to flag. I mean, we debated whether or not it should also just be fair value, but I think it's probably appropriate for now. The IASB is looking at entity combinations under common control, and that might have an implication going forward, but for now it's aligned to our literature. Thanks.
Thanks, Lindy. Not seeing any other flags raised, so I sense we're okay on that. Can I take then comments on the other proposed edits to the standard in response to constituents? Camira.
Thanks, Chair. I just had a couple of comments, not in the proposed edits, but in the way we are addressing the comments of some respondents. So especially, for instance, the respondent number 13 in the analysis, we are saying, so the respondent is saying that the cumulative revenue and expenses should be recognized in the statement of financial performance instead of the statement of changes in net assets and equity. And then here in the analysis, we are saying that the paragraph, especially the paragraph 48, is consistent with IFRS, but actually it's not, because in IFRS, they refer to other comprehensive income. Of course, in the IPSAS, we do not have other comprehensive income. So I think we should explain that clearer, so that, because that could lead to confusion. Another comment that I wanted to make, there was some feedback that we received. They are asking like to add a bit of guidance. I don't know if this is feasible or not, but in terms of the change of the assets as a category from non-cash generating units. So in the case the entity already has the asset classified as a non-cash generating, and then in the moment they classify it as asset held for sale, if they need to reclassify it to a cash generating unit, if we could be clarified on that. So that was basically it. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. I mean, I think your first point was just in terms of the analysis, you know, I mean, I think I'm not sure how we deal with that process-wise. I mean, can I have comments from staff in terms of the second point? I'm not really sure that it's an issue that we actually need to provide additional guidance. I mean, we can, you know, people always want additional guidance, but I'm not convinced that we need it. It's not already covered by existing guidance. Ross?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand what additional guidance we're thinking of here at all. And I think we should remember that this is a standard where we are aligned with an IFRS, and I think similar issues would have been considered. So I'm not really sure I'm understanding the public sector reason why we would add anything additionally. I think, again, the board spent a lot of time discussing ED 79, and the big public sector difference was the disclosure for accountability purposes to when the fair value is higher than the carrying amount. I'm not sure these other issues, I'm seeing the public sector hook in this. So I think it's good to reconsider, but I'm just not sure what we would do to deal with this.
Camira, back on that.
Yes, I think the public sector reason is more this distinction between cash generating and non-cash generating assets and impairment. Remember that we have to separate impairment standards, and that is not in the private sector. So I think what they do, probably they are not expecting a long detailed guidance, but only to clarify what should they do in terms of impairment if the asset will change from being a non-cash generating to be a cash generating, because they will be applying ED 79 if they need to consider that the standard IPSAS 26 or the standard IPSAS 21 when considering impairment, if that is the case. I think that should be the expectation, but again, we can discuss that offline if you would like. Thanks.
Well, I think we just need to resolve this matter now. I don't think, I mean, Ross, you know, to you.
Yeah, again, I think once you comply with this standard and you're classifying an asset for held for sale, you measure it in accordance with this standard. So it's not an impairment issue. It's whether it's the carrying amount or the fair value is lower, then you write it down to the fair value. So I think it's a non-issue.
I mean, it's not cash generating anyway, in terms of the fact that it's held for sale. So you've got your existing value. You are either applying fair value or you're disclosing fair value less cost of sale, and that's it. So I don't think there's an issue there. Okay, so I think with that, we're through the analysis of comments. We are through the proposed amendments. So Joe, unless there's anything else you want to bring to our attention, I think we are at the stage where we could move into the formal approval process.
Okay, no, I don't have anything else to raise. So we are proposing an effective date of 1 January 2025.
Sorry, before you, Claudia, did you have one more point?
Yeah, because it was not in the paper, but before we start with the approval, I would like to understand how we deal with the fair value definition. In the proposed standard, we refer to the fair value definition of the new ED measurement standard. The ED measurement standard isn't approved so far. So in the IPSAS 33 standard, we added a paragraph in the definition with where we cleared how we understand the fair value in this specific standard. So I'm not sure how we deal with this standard. We have some references in the standard where we discuss about fair value measurement if the highest and best use of a non-financial asset differs from the current use. So the standard is in line with the new IFRS 13 fair value definition, and I would like to understand if we approve now the standard, how we deal with the standard.
Thanks, Claudia. Dave.
So I hadn't noticed this, Claudia. I think it's a really good point. In paragraph 10, to your point, we refer to fair value in ED 77. I propose that we remove this paragraph because the paragraph immediately above talks about terms defined in other standards. You look to other standards, and I think we just leave as is until our IPSAS measurement standard comes in.
So you're proposing that comes in as consequential. Lynn.
That's not the only paragraph that refers to ED 77, for example, paragraph 56. I just happened to scroll through and saw that. So I think you're going to have to do a check throughout on this point.
I mean, it does strike me that this is exactly the same situation that we had in terms of leases. And the cleanest way to deal with it may actually be in the way that we dealt with it in leases, in that we referred essentially to, in that case, to IFRS 15 as a temporary expedient. And I would propose that we take exactly the same approach here. I mean, it's a temporary, it may well be a temporary, timing issue. But I think that's probably the cleanest, so that we are consistent. And then when we get to approval of the new measurement standard, then we just replace those references. Okay, so if everyone's content, we take that approach. And thanks, Claudia, for picking that one up.
Excuse me, Chair. In IPSAS 33, I think we didn't have a reference to IFRS 13. We have added it in definition of fair value, which is like fair value for the purpose of the standard is the amount of which an asset could be exchanged or liability settled between knowledging, willing parties in the arm's length transaction. And I think we don't have any reference to IFRS 13. That will come in as a consequential amendment when we will approve our measurement standard. So I would prefer to use the same approach as we had in 33 to add a definition of fair value and delete any reference to the ED measurement, and bring in this new different view on what is fair value with the new standard.
Dave.
So Claudia, I take your point. I was looking at the reference that Lynn made in paragraph 56 to ED 77, and the IPSAS 33 fix that you propose won't work because there's reference to level 2 and 3 in paragraph 56 that Lynn refers to. So I think in this case, we have to go ahead with what Ian proposes and refer to IFRS 13. I think that's the best way forward for this little gap that we'll have.
And it is a time, it's just a limited time that we have to bring that in. But I mean, given that we've literally just used that expedient in IPSAS 43 for exactly the same situation. I think that is actually, being consistent. Let's just go that way. Okay. So with that, and we will need to make sure those changes are made consistently throughout. Can we go back into the proposals in terms of approval?
Okay, so as I was saying, yes, we're proposing an effective date of 1 January 2025, which is to align with leases, because there are some linkages there. And as you've just raised, there are actually linkages with ED 77 and some other standards. So it may be a point that we either do a consequential amendment or we push the effective date out, depending on how close we are to approving those other IPSASs as well. So if the board is happy with that effective date, we can move to the vote on the approval.
Ross.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks, Chair. So normally, as we didn't have this plan for approval, but because of the lack of issues, you would have a paper that sets out the due process requirements. So I'm just going to read in and we'll minute the assertion that I'm required to make before a board approves the standard. So as the program and technical director, I assert that due process has been followed effectively, noting that we issued exposure draft ED 79, non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations, and that was exposed for public consultation. We received comments on that consultation, I think 34 in total, and those are posted publicly on the website and available. We've analyzed those comments and we've deliberated those in the meeting, including those considered significant. And the IPSASB has been asked whether they see any issues that haven't been not picked up in the comments, and we've deliberated those today. So with that, I assert that due process has been followed and we can move to a vote. If everyone's okay with that.
Not seeing any flags up on that, so I think we're content due process has been followed.
Great. So today we have 16 members present. Patricia and Scott are absent today. So I'm going to ask for a vote by those online raising their hands and those in the room to please raise their hand and keep it up until I'm done counting, just so I get everybody. So with that, if you vote in favor of the pronouncement, please raise your hand and leave it raised. So I have 8 in the room. And I have 8 online, so that is 16, and we have 16 members present, so that means no abstentions and no votes against. So with that, we have IPSAS 44, non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross. So if you can take us through the remainder of the due process. Do we not need to confirm effective dates and re-exposure?
Yeah. Thanks, Ian, you're right. So Joe proposed an effective date of January 1st, 2025 to align with leases. So first I'll ask if members agree with that effective date. And again, noting that if we do move the leases date in the future, we will also shift this date as well.
Can I check members are content with that proposal? Okay, so we have that 1 January 25 effective date.
And the last thing is consideration of re-exposure, and have there been any significant changes since the exposure draft that would merit the board re-exposing the new pronouncement? And as there were very little significant comments, there is no basis for consideration of re-exposure. So I do not make any recommendation for re-exposure.
Thank you, Ross. Just check nobody's going to contest that. Good. Okay, so with that, we have IPSAS 44, effective date 1 January 2025. Thank you very much, Joe, for the work you've put into this. Thank you, David, as well, as the board sponsor on that. That's well done. Thank you.
Thank you all.
So with that, Ross, I think we now move into your update on the work programme and also further discussion of the proposed additions to the work plan, carrying on from the item the other day.
Yes, that's right. So I've got a couple slides, so just one quick minute. It looks like the slides are now up. So I'm going to take you through a couple slides and show you an updated work program. Hopefully it comes through readable on the screen. So first, going back to the mid-period work program consultation, clearly the landscape has changed quite considerably since we put out the proposals last summer on the work program consultation. And that really comes down to the progress on our current work program projects. So I think we were a little more ambitious than we were able to achieve on moving forward our major projects. Therefore, we haven't created as much space as we thought we would have in the work program by this point. And also the international developments related to sustainability have caused us to move significantly quicker than we were planning on when we put that consultation out last summer. So what does that mean for the work program itself? So as per our discussions on Monday, I think it means in 2022, the 4 projects on the screen are the ones we're committing to adding to the work program and trying to start some level of work on. So the 2 major projects we discussed, presentation of financial statements and differential reporting. And the plan for those projects is to start the scoping research phase of those projects over the summer so that we can have deliberations with national standard setters on the scope and remit of those projects at the September Public Sector Standard Setters Forum to inform the development of a project brief thereafter. We discussed in detail and the board agreed that it would add a Theme C project, a limited scope project, on reporting sustainability program information. And as you'll recall, this is our first foray into work on sustainability and building on the guidance in RPG 3 and 1 and working together with the OECD Green Budget Collective to make our financial information much more useful for policy decisions and budgeting. And we're going to start work on that project relatively soon, working together with the OECD Green Budgeting Collective, and then hopefully by the end of the year, have a project brief ready for board approval. And then the last point is the one we'll be discussing in the private session soon, is the consultation paper, Advancing Public Sector Sustainability Reporting. This is obviously something we're looking to approve, and this should go on the work program. So because those items are actually ones we'll be dedicating resources to and doing work on in 2022, we do believe those should be added to the work program. And in the work program, I'll show you in a minute, you'll see those noted on there. And then just to note that each December, we'll do an in-depth review of the work program. So that will occur again based on progress. I'll update then. But even at each meeting, we do have this discussion on the work program. So there'll be more opportunities to discuss the progress and level of work on these new initiatives, as well as the current projects on the work program. So here's the updated work program with the changes. And this is just a rough draft. This isn't yet a reflection of all the milestones or not, but you'll see at the bottom in light blue, advancing sustainability in the public sector and the approval of a CP in March. Then it's out for consultation, and then the IPSASB will deliberate to determine next steps December and March 2023 in that time period. And then you'll see I've added a section at the bottom of the work program, which is new 2022 projects. And it doesn't come out great. It's kind of covering, for those in the room, the very bottom one, but it's the new Theme C project, reporting service performance information, presentation of financial statements, and differential reporting. You'll note that I haven't added any timelines yet, just for the simple reason that we haven't really looked into it yet, but I will be adding some new indicative information on those projects for the June meeting to show the planned work on research and scoping throughout the year. I've also made the adjustment that we discussed on day one on improvements when the board agreed that we would next do it in March 2023. And obviously I'll need to update this work program for the approval of IPSAS 44 because this did show June before. So I haven't picked that change up. I didn't want to get ahead of the board's discussions today. Maybe pause there.
So just leaving that up then for a moment, pause to take comments and reactions to the approach that Ross has taken there in terms of the addition of the projects that we've agreed during this meeting. Yeah, Lynn.
So in terms of the agreements around the additional projects, that looks fine. The rationale of where we've got to on adding the additional projects, though, is that some of the existing projects are taking more board time and more debate, and yet we're not reflecting that in the top line still, the revenue transfer expenses and the measurement. We're still, I feel perhaps optimistically, still showing that September anticipated approval. I guess my question is, at what time do we publicly say that that's unlikely? Because it is part of the rationale for us not adding more projects at the bottom.
Ross.
Yeah, Lynn, I think that's a good point on measurement and the revenue and transfer expenses projects at the moment. I think we're coming to the agreement that probably 2 meetings isn't going to get either one there. But again, that's something I kind of want the board to discuss a little bit and agree on if everyone's okay that we put those back 1 quarter. And again, as you said, Lynn, that is part of the justification. So it's probably the time to do that. But again, I hadn't consulted specific task force chairs and people around the room, so I didn't want to unilaterally make that change.
Thanks, Ross. So I think, what's being proposed is that we put the timeframes back to December. And I think, Lynn, you were sort of, indicating that you thought that was necessary on both revenue and transfer expenses and the measurement group of projects. I think there is also the question which we discussed the other day, which is actually, should we think about now indicating perhaps through a dotted line presentation or something like that, the fact that we are thinking in terms of re-exposure on revenue and transfer expenses, even although we haven't actually formally made that decision. Clearly it's indicated in a footnote at the moment, but actually that's making it somewhat more explicit, and certainly in terms of the discussion we'll need to include in the feedback statement, perhaps all of that actually does tie together better. I just want to check that other members are content with that sort of approach. David, from the measurement task force point of view.
I was glad you didn't mention the year associated with December, but no, I think, I'm content with that to happen. And I think actually from if you like, a public interest perspective, that we should do that now, and we should include the indicative sort of re-exposure, because our constituents want to know that sort of thing. So I support that.
Okay. So everyone okay with Ross making those changes, and that would appear in the next version that's made publicly available. And I think it would certainly make sense that in terms of the publication of the feedback statement, that's available publicly. Because it's obviously part of our thought process. Ross.
Yeah, so I'll make those changes and all those updates now that they're agreed by the board, and that'll end up on the posted work program on the website, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Okay, so I think we're fine with those changes.
So that leaves us on the work program items with everything else we proposed and what we do with those. So, and that's basically all of the narrow scope projects that we had proposed originally in the mid-period consultation program. So the limited scope changes to IPSAS 21, 31, 33, and the practice statement on materiality judgment. So what do we do with those now? So from a staff perspective, what we were thinking is we should consider these pre-commitments, as the board does intend to do them, did think they were of higher level of public interest than other projects to put them forward, and they did receive support from constituents. So clearly the board has a higher level of commitment to those projects than other projects. So the thinking is clearly we're not going to have space to do anything on those in 2022, but the strategy period does cover through to 2023. And there might be work resources that become available where we can pick some of these up and start making progress on them. So the thinking is that during 2023, as items are completed, this is a list of projects we'll pick from. The board will make determination at that time which of the projects to take once we see the resources we have, and have a little more information on scoping from staff on what we do in each project. So, you know, we'd like to call those pre-commitments and note those in the feedback statement as that to be picked up in 2023. And then obviously we're moving into our big strategy consultation and work program consultation, and that requires us to put out an indicative work program for the next 5 years. And we ask for comments from constituents at that time on the broader work program. So those pre-commitments would be on that work program along with our current projects, and we'd put that out for consultation along with any new proposed projects that we plan to deal with in the 2024 to 2028 work program period. We think this balances the feedback we received, that these should be prioritized by the board, but also that we're dealing with the reality that we don't have the resources to do them that we thought we were going to have. And that this is an appropriate way to take it forward and be transparent with our constituents on how we intend to manage the work program over the next couple of years.
Thanks, Ross. So open for comments from members on that proposed approach on those projects. Yeah, Claudia.
Thanks for the explanation. So I agree with the next steps we have planned, but I have another addition, comment. We are talking about that we need to expose and define our new strategy and work plan from 2024 onwards, and it would be helpful if we would include in our IPSAS board work program also a line that we start with the work on our next strategy and work plan.
Thanks, Claudia. Other comments? Thomas.
Yeah, I think regarding the minor projects, I think probably it comes back to wording, how you phrase it in the end, because kind of thinking about the new strategy 2024 onwards, and given kind of the challenges regarding sustainability reporting, it could be that your priorities shift in a way that even these minor projects are not kind of being seen as relevant anymore as when you consulted them out in last year. So I would be careful to call it pre-commitment, because it might change. Perhaps you realize that the kind of the burden for the board, including the sustainability reporting, is so heavy that you really need to focus on the big ticket items, and these minor projects are not that important anymore, just from a wording perspective.
Well, I mean, pre-commitment, I think it's actually about the wording that we use in relation to the development of the 24 to 28 strategy, because clearly we have committed on, we have consulted on these, we have support from our constituents, as you say. They will need to take a view when we know the answer on sustainability reporting, on whether we've got additional resources, all of those issues. So, that's where we need to be careful, because obviously they would be proposed, as a commitment on the 24 to 28. Clearly, at that stage, the board would need to take a view on all of the factors, and we've agreed that in any case, we will do a thorough assessment of all the potential projects that we've accumulated through various consultations and so on. So all of that comes back together, but I think you would nevertheless need to recognise that these have been consulted on and received support during 2021. So I think it's the drafting, not necessarily the term pre-commitment, it's the drafting around it that goes in the feedback statement to sort of make that process clear. Okay, so I'm seeing that the board seems content with that approach, recognising the somewhat dynamic environment we're in at the moment. Ross, anything else then in terms of?
No, just thanks for the input and the thoughtfulness from the board on this. It's an interesting time to balance the work program, because we are dealing with this big sustainability item, and how to work that into an already very full work program and deliver on the commitments. And that's a tough balance to achieve at the moment with so much going on. But thanks for the insights and thoughts. We'll get the wording right to make sure that we catch the nuance of your point, Thomas, and Ian's response, because I think that is key for the work on the strategy itself, that people understand where we are at the moment and where the board's planning for the next 4 years, which again isn't quite clear at the moment, but will be more clear by the end of the year when we're looking to put that out.
Thanks, Ross. So in terms of just how we communicate these decisions that we've made, the process that was proposed in the paper was that there will be a feedback statement, which is not an authoritative board document, but nevertheless, I think it is it is sensitive for the reasons that we've just been discussing. So the proposal was that you saw a first draft attached to the work program paper. The proposal was that that document should be finalised with amendments to reflect the discussions that we've had here during this week, and that in terms of the finalising that, it would be appropriate to reconvene the task force that we had for the development of the original work programme proposal, and just to get the members of that task force to oversee the finalisation of the feedback statement. And the members of that task force were selected on the basis that they were they were going to be ongoing board members rather than board members that left at the end of 2021. So I wanted to check that the board would be content with that approach to finalising that feedback statement, because the proposal is that is issued in the first week in May, alongside natural resources and the Advancing Public Sector Sustainability paper. Everyone content that that's a reasonable way forward, bearing in mind the non-authoritative nature of that document? Lynn?
Yeah, I'm absolutely content, and that's the way forward. That does feel sensible. I think earlier in the meeting this week, at one point we said that we wouldn't reconvene task force to be editorial groups, and we would have independence between the two. And I guess it's just to note that I guess in this instance the task force is acting as a editorial group, which is fine. I think that is the right answer. But then was getting me to think about, we have all of these different types of groups and task force, drafting groups, editorial groups. We do need flexibility of when we use them, but it's probably a while since we as a board have just sort of reminded ourselves of kind of like what the purpose of the various different groups are and when they come into play. And I wondered if that might be something we could perhaps pick up for the next meeting, even if it's in private session of the board, just to remind ourselves of what are the tools that we can use in terms of the different groups and when do we use them? Because I think sometimes it's we're a little confused on that point, and I think it's sort of, we ought to be more publicly accountable in terms of how we use those tools.
Ross, back on that.
Yeah, Lynn, I agree with you, and happy to have that discussion. I think in terms of being accountable for the types of groups, we have a lot of leeway on the different groups we can use in due process. They all fall under our task force procedures in our due process. So we do have specific reasons why we call them different things, but that can be lost sometimes on the broader board and definitely on the broader public. So I do think that's a good discussion to have, just to remind how operationally why staff use the different terms and how we look at those different and have different functions, because it is helpful to keep them directed in what we're trying to do, but completely take your point that it gets to be a bit of a word scramble, mouthful to determine which type of group we are and what they're doing. So more than happy to spend some time on that.
Thanks, Ross. Renee, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thank you. So it's a different point, but it's kind of building on being publicly accountable as a board. So when I read the draft consultation process summary, towards the end, we referred to the fact that respondents provided us suggestions on a wide range of projects, and that there's little consistency in those projects, and that eventually the longer list would be added or part of developing our 2024-28 strategy. So I'm just reflecting on this, thinking, is that sufficiently transparent, and would there be merit in the way that we deal and communicate these potential topics? Would there be merit and value in reporting back to our constituents on what that list is? I think it would help with being accountable and transparent, but also I think it'd be useful for constituents to understand amongst themselves what are the types of topics that are coming up, and help people reflect, even help myself as a board member reflect on what are those topics that are top of mind to some of our constituents, and keep them on the horizon, like knowing that these are not projects that we're signing up for, but from a transparent communication perspective. So I just wanted to raise that point to understand if there was appetite to change the way we communicate those. Thank you.
Thanks, Renee. Ross.
Yeah, Renee, that's a good point. Happy to consider that and whether we want to put that list in that feedback statement or not. We do have the long list of projects we had from the last strategy and work program consultation that we did publish. And from a transparency perspective, I don't see that as a concern, because what we do is we post the responses in full. So that is there, and that's part of the public record. That doesn't come down. So people are well aware of the projects that have been suggested, but happy to take away and consider whether we just start that documentation of the longer list, because we're going to need it anyway for the broader 2024 strategy consultation and the work we're going to need to do on that. So we've got the analysis anyway. It's not hard to pull together.
Thank you, Ross. And it may be that then that gets fed more into the board papers, rather than, I think there might be a confusion if we sort of add it as an appendix to the actual feedback statement as a formal document.
Yeah, maybe it could be a document that resides somewhere else in our communication vehicles, and the document just refers to it. And in response to Ross's point, yeah, we can go and look and responses, but it's all over the place. So it's not very user friendly. So it's
yeah. I mean, I think you're right. We need to draw together a list, and potentially that could just be added to the website, because one problem we do have is that if we include those in the feedback statement, then what do we do about the other projects that have come through the fora and so on? So in a sense, that would be elevating those. So I think if we can just add a sort of summary note to the what's on the website at the moment, and then that feeds into that long list of projects that we're going to need to consider for the strategy. Okay. Good. So thank you for that, for those proposals, Ross. I think that wraps things up neatly in terms of progress on the work programme and how we communicate the decisions we've made this week as a board in terms of adding projects to the work programme and the pre-commitments. Ross, anything else then? So I think with that actually brings us to the end of the public part of this meeting. I want to record our thanks as a board to the IFAC staff and to Leah and Vanessa in particular. There has been a lot of additional organisation that's gone into getting us started on the move back into physical operation. You know, I think that has certainly, from my perspective in terms of being here, it's incredibly welcome to have been able to interact with the other board members. And I think the whole process has actually gone extremely smoothly, bearing in mind all the variable factors that we had to bear in mind beforehand. So just huge thank you for everything that's been done. Obviously, the plan is that we will be meeting in person again here in New York in June. Clearly, we're going to have to keep monitoring the situation in the intervening period. So, you know, we will be in touch in terms of practical arrangements and so on, because we are going to need to keep things under review. The board itself, as part of our in-camera, we will just have a debrief in terms of how we feel the discussions have gone, bearing in mind that we've had a number of board members present virtually, as well as those present in person here in New York. But those are the proposals for June. Ross, I don't know if there's anything else I should add on that, whether you... Clearly, we are going to have to keep things under review, but that's the intention at the moment, that we will be here for the June meeting. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. I think it has been a very productive board meeting, you know, notwithstanding the challenges we've had. We've progressed a lot of projects, and I think we've got a lot of good direction on those ongoing ones as well as those approvals. So thank you, everyone. Really just remains for me to wish you, you know, safe travels for those returning, and really everybody stay safe. Thank you very much for contributing to this very successful board meeting. Thank you. Now, in terms of the board members, obviously we now move into